Hi, this is Brian with Prophetless Media and Post. Today we're going to take a look at a full VFX shot from beginning to end. In this shot, we're going to add animated 3D text to our scene and have it animate through several objects and cast shadows on all the objects within the scene. This will be part 2 of a 2-part tutorial. In part 1, we'll go through the entire process of tracking our camera in Syntheyes, setting up geometry to be used for our shadow catchers and rotoscoping, and exporting to Davinci Resolve Fusion using distortion workflow. In part 2 of the tutorial, we will import our camera and set up Davinci Resolve Fusion for our undistorted workflow. We will animate our 3D text to start off in the distance and then animate to go through 3 poles and end up in front of the camera. Then we will set up 3D rotoscoping using our 3D camera solve to speed up the rotoscoping for each one of the poles. And then finally, we'll set up shadow catchers for the ground and the 3 poles so as the text moves through our scene, it interacts realistically with the real-world space. So let's head over to Davinci Resolve Fusion. Okay, so now we're in Davinci Resolve, and we have our clip already loaded up. So let's head over to the Fusion tab. And if you use the option inside Syntheyes to copy to clipboard, you'd be able to paste in your 3D camera. But I'm going to show you a different method that you can use to import your composition. When we import the composition directly, it's going to erase everything that's in here. So if you've already started doing some composition work and then did the Syntheyes tracking, make sure that you copy all the nodes that are inside your comp and then bring in your Fusion comp. So let's go up to File, Import Fusion Composition, find our composition. And once the composition is brought in, we'll just hit paste. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take our media in, and I'm going to replace this camera 01 shot, which is the media in node from Syntheyes. And let's just delete that camera 1 shot. And then I'm going to take our media out and put it at the end of our script. So now we have all of this. Okay, and so now let's take a look at our renderer. We have a little bit of a problem here. So your script may not do this. Some of the paths may not be correct. So we can fix that pretty easily. Let's take a look at the tracking mesh first. You can see the tracking mesh has the wrong path. So one way we could do this is you could go into each one of these nodes that are disconnected and browse for it and reconnect. But I'm going to show you a quicker way to do it, and that is to copy the path. And then if we go up to Fusion Settings, and we go down to Path Map, let's add a new path map. And what this is going to do is we're going to put in the path map that is in these nodes. So let's paste that in. And then we're going to redirect it to a different path. So everything in this composition that has this path is going to be changed to whatever path we put here. All of our tracking mesh in cards is here on the desktop. So I'm going to click that. So now all of our paths will be correct. Hit save. And then it will reconnect all of the nodes. So that's just a quick tip, and that's a great tip you can use if you're working with a team of people on different computers. This is a quick way you can set up a script to change everything to work. So now let's rearrange this a little bit. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take these lights that came in from Syntheyes and let's delete those. For now, I'm going to take these cards and let's disconnect them. So holding Shift to just click on those cards. And actually, let's take this tracking mesh just for a moment and disconnect that. So the next thing we should do is let's add in our 3D text. I'm going to add in a text 3D. We'll just add that in. Drop that into our 3D scene. And let's type out something here. And let's change the color a little bit. Okay, so now we have our text. You can see it there. Let's also add a little bit of extrusion to make it a little bit more exciting. So I'm going to grab the extrusion. So you can see we have our 3D text here, but it's definitely not in the right position. And when we did the 3D tracking, we added a point right next to this pole because that's where we want to start the 3D text. So one thing we can do is let's bring our 3D scene up into the viewer. And if we right click inside the scene, let's change our camera from our perspective to the camera that we just tracked. So now we're looking through. And in this 3D scene, it's pretty easy to pick out the tracking points that you want. I'm going to turn off this grid for a second so you can see this better. So let's go to 3D options and turn off the grid. So now that we're looking through the 3D camera in the 3D scene, we can actually grab these tracking markers. So this is the one that we want right next to the pole. Let's just right click, come down to the bottom of the menu and go to the right and copy the tracker position. Now we can go into the text. And if we go over to the translation, we can just right click, paste translate group setting, and that's going to push the 3D text right over to that position. So I'm going to change this a little bit. Let's get it to face this way. And actually, let's make this text a little bit bigger. It's a little too small. Something like that. And let's just move it over into position. So something like that's probably a good starting point for our animation. So let's go back over to the translation. And what we want to do here is we want to right click and click Animate Translate Group. And so you can see these markers are in red. That means we have a keyframe on that frame. So now we can go to the end of the shot. Let's go back to our perspective view. So let's go to Camera, Perspective View. And what we want to do is move this text so that it comes up past the 3 poles. And if we look at this point cloud, you can see here, this is one of the poles, this is the second, and this is the pole that's all the way in the front. So we can just bring our 3D text and bring it here in 3D space, and then just position it so that it's in front of the camera. So probably something like that. Let's take a look at the final render. Okay, that's not perfectly positioned. I've already done the settings so that it'll be straight, so you don't have to watch me fiddle with it. So let me just paste those in. There. Now it's nice and centered on the end of the shot. And if we go through, we can see we have a nice animation of the text coming through the scene. Okay, great. So now we can't see that very well. So now let's add in a spotlight. I'm going to add, whoops, I had the text selected, so it made a merge. We don't want that. So let's delete the merge, and we're just going to bring the spotlight straight in. And let's go back into our 3D scene. And the position of the spotlight, we want it way up above the scene, and we want to make sure that it's in front of the closest pole. So we want it to be up, come back some, and probably way up. And then we're going to want to rotate it straight down. So I already have the settings for the spotlight, the position set up. So I'm just going to paste those in. Just paste translate group and paste rotate group. So you can see that this is the position that I got for the light. We're going to need to widen the cone. So let's get the cone angle wider so that it spreads light all over the entire scene. And now let's take a look at what we have. So now we're starting to get some light into the scene. Does it work at the end? Sure, that looks good. So the next thing we want to do is add some shadows to our scene. So now we can add back in our tracking mesh, and we're going to have to change a few settings to get our shadows to show up. So let's go into the camera renderer first, and we want to change our render type to software renderer for our shadows. And let's go back over to the tracking mesh, and we're going to have to go underneath the lighting, turn on shadow receiver, and then let's go over to the texture. And we're going to want the texture to be pure white because the operation we're going to use is multiply. Anything that's white will be transparent and anything else will stay in the scene. And then we're going to turn off the lighting and turn on the shadows. And once we do that, you can start to see the shadows showing up here. But to see how well it's blending in with the scene, we want to make this ground plane a shadow catcher. So let's go to the blend mode, and under software, let's change that additive to multiply, and that will multiply it during the 3D render. So now we just have the shadow. If we come up closer, you can see that we have just the shadow here. That's not too bad. We need to work on this shadow a little bit. So let's go into the spotlight. Let's go down to the shadows. So we have a bunch of different options in here. One of the options you're definitely going to want to look into is the shadow map size. Right now it's only a 1K map size, which is not very much. And if you take a look at that shadow and we just go up to 2K, you can see it immediately. That's looking a lot better. The one thing about the map size though is the larger we go, the more process it's going to take. So it will slow down your comp. While we're in this phase where we're putting everything together, it's good to keep this at a lower number. And at the end, we'll probably move it up to something like 4K. The next thing I want to do is add a little bit of density because that's a little bit lighter than you can see these shadows here. So I'm going to bring this up maybe to 7. And the shadow is a little harsh. Let's go down to softness and I'm going to use variable. And let's soften that shadow a little bit. So something like that is looking pretty good. So you can dial in the, work with these numbers and dial it in. We just wanted to get it pretty close until we get to the final render. So now we have our shadow all set up and it's looking pretty good throughout the scene. The next step we want to take a look at is how we can get these poles to occlude the text when it's behind it. I did a video previously where we talked about using cards in 3D space to set up our roto shape to occlude objects. And we're going to use that method here. So we're going to make a little bit more room here. Let's move this over here. And let's bring in one of the first cards. So I'm going to bring in card 1. Bring our undistorted plate into the card. I'm going to copy this camera. And we're going to paste it twice. This will need 2. With the card selected, let's add a UV map 3D. And inside that UV map 3D, let's change the map mode to camera. And then we'll take our animated camera and drop it in. And once we do that, you can see that we have a very blue background, which is because the card has a texture color on it, so we just need to remove that, make it white. Okay, so now if we take a look at this, we have our card in 3D space, and you can see that our pole is stabilized in 3D space. So now we just need to convert that to 2D. So I'm going to grab our UV map, and we're going to merge it into our 3D scene. And in this 3D scene, what we're going to do is take this camera and make it static on one frame. So I'm going to go to frame 85, go into the translation settings for the camera, and we need to go up to the top, unlock the camera so that we can alter it. And under translation, right click, remove all from translate group, and then under rotation, remove all from rotate group. And so that's going to get rid of all the keyframes and it'll be static on frame 85. And let's add a renderer so you can, whoops. Let's add a renderer to that so you can see what we just did. So now this pole will be stabilized on frame 85. So as we go through, you can see the pole is static. So now we can do our rotoscope on this frame. After this renderer, just hit A. I'm going to add a matte control. And I've already done the roto, so I'm just going to paste that in. Drop that into the foreground of the matte control. We have a keyframe on frame 85. And we have a keyframe here at frame 32. And another one at 171. And that's just because there's a flat card and this is a cylinder shape with the parallax, and there's going to be a little bit of slippage. But honestly, 3 keyframes is a lot better than trying to rotoscope for 228 frames. Let's get back to this. So we have our roto shape. We got into our matte control. And inside the matte control, let's go to combine. We want to change that to combine alpha and then post multiply image. Now something went wrong. It's off. And that's because the camera renderer, let's take a look at the camera renderer, is 1920 by 1080. And we are using an undistorted workflow. So by default, when we added the renderer, it went to the final composition size. So we just need to change this render size to the proper size. So inside the camera renderer, let's go over to the settings, turn off auto resolution, and let's put in 1998 by 1124. Okay, and now let's see what we got. There we go. Now everything's lined up. And I did want to mention the same thing is going to happen with the roto shape. If we bring in a polygon, if we go over to the settings, you can see the output size is to default, which will default to the final output size. But since we're using undistorted, we need to make sure that we go into custom output size and make sure that we change this so that it matches the undistorted size. Otherwise, everything will shift off. Okay, just want to point that out. Okay, so now that we have our matte, and we have our matte throughout the entire shot, now we can just take our card and our UV map and copy that. Let's paste it over here. And we're going to take our matte control, drop it right into our card, and then we're going to use the exact same static camera in that UV map. And then we can take that and drop it into our 3D scene. And let's look at the final render. So there you can see that it's blocking out the 3D text. I forgot to turn off one thing. In the card, the final card, we need to go to the lighting and turn off affected by lighting, and then it will be the natural color. So here now we have our text is occluded, and then once it gets passed, you can see it doesn't occlude it because it's in 3D space. So that's going to save a lot of time in the long run. Okay, so now we just need to do the same thing to the other two cards. So I'm just going to do this real quickly. So now we have the other three cards set up. I had already done the roto for each one, and we set it up exactly the same, just changed out the cards and the rotoscoping. So now you can see here in the 3D space, we have our 1, 2, 3 poles. And so we can take a look here at the final render, and you can see now we have all the poles, including the 3D text. And if we come to the end, you can see how it passes through. Okay, so now that we have that done, really we want as this passes through, so let's get to, so now, right now, at this point, there should be some shadow on this pole here. So we need to set something up for just the shadows. So the way we're going to do that is that we're going to break this out into two different sections. We want to have one render where it's just the 3D text as one render pass, and then in the other render pass, we want just the shadows. That'll give us the most options when we're compositing in the end, so we can add grain and blur and alter the image so that it really blends in. So the way we're going to do that is let's first start by taking the main footage out of this 3D scene so that now we're just dealing with the poles and the 3D text. And I'm going to bring this, let's rearrange this a little bit. I'm going to bring our original footage up here, and then let's reconnect it to the very end of our composition. So if we go over here, you can see we're right at the end of the redistortion. We had the merge, and let's swap the inputs so that our main footage is in the background here, and our 3D text will be coming into the foreground. Just try to keep this organized. So for the 3D text, we're not going to need the shadow. So we're going to take the tracking mesh off, and let's bring it up here a little bit. Let's also grab the camera, the 3D scene, and the camera renderer, and let's copy that. And we're going to paste that up here. Because the way our composition is going to work out is we want our original footage to come through this pipeline, come down, and then we're going to have these shadows multiply on top of there. And that's going to come down to here where we're going to have our 3D text rendered out on top of the shadows and then rendered out for our final comp. So let's start with the 3D text. So right now we have this right here, and that's not exactly what we want. What we want is just the 3D text with it being occluded wherever it is being occluded. So one way we can do that is let's branch this out. So make a little bit more room here. We want two different renderers. So I'm going to copy that same renderer and paste it. So we have two different branches. In this first render, we want just the alpha here. And one way that we can make this operation work is to use a holdout. So what we can do is come over to the 3D text and let's add in a override 3D. And in this override, what we want to do is change it to do matte is matte. And you can see what just happened there. It subtracted the 3D text from our alpha channel. How we can use this is use it as a holdout matte. So now let's take a look at the camera renderer, the second camera renderer. Let's put this alpha. And what we want to do in this one is we want to add another override. Add that to our scene, and we're going to shift and bring it right in between the 3D scene and our second camera renderer. And in this override, we basically want to clear everything out. So we want to do unseen by camera, unseen by cameras. So that's going to make everything invisible except for our camera and our lights. So what we can do is bring back in the 3D text. So we're going to take our 3D text, bring it right over to the end of the override, and that's going to make a merge 3D. And now you can see that we have, whoops, let's get to the camera render. Now we can see that we have our 3D text. Let me move that to the other side. Now you can see we have our 3D text by itself. There's no lighting on it right now, and that's because inside the 3D scene, we just need to turn on the pass-through lights. And now we have our lighting. Now all we need to do is merge these two together and use this alpha here to hold out the 3D text. Grabbing the 3D text render, bring it down here to a merge. And in this merge, you leave the apply node at normal, and in the operator, change it to held out. And you can see what just happened. Now, as this text goes through, you can see that it's being held out wherever the poles are. So that looks great. So now we have our 3D text blending into the scene properly. And now we have full control too. So here now we can add a blur if we want to, or add grain to the 3D text. The next thing we need to do is set up our shadow catcher. So now we did all this work on each one of these poles, and we can actually use all that information to set up our shadow catchers. I need to organize this just a little bit more. So if we take a look at how we set this whole setup here, basically when we got to this point here, this whole section right here was set up just so that we could set up our rotoscope in the right position. But now that we have our rotoscope, we don't really need this part of it. We can just use this part. So this part right here, for each one of these cards, is all we really need, plus our static camera. So let's select all of these, copy them, and then can come way up here, and let's paste them. The other thing we're going to need is our static camera. This is our static camera from frame 85. So let's copy that. Bring that up here, paste it. And let's add our camera into our UV map 3D. And then we can take each one of these UV map 3Ds and put it right into our 3D scene. So we're not seeing anything quite yet, and that's because we haven't added in a background. So let's grab a background. And in the background, we got to make sure that we have the right frame size. So let's turn off auto resolution and put it in the correct undistorted size. Okay. And then let's also in this background, we want this background to be pure white. because it's going to be multiplied. So let's grab that, put it into the map control. And you can see there we have starting to get the shapes to show up. And let's take a look at our 3D scene now. Now we have our maps out there. Let's look in the renderer. Okay. The next thing we can do is actually we want to also add this white background to our camera. And that's going to make everything in the scene white. So now it's pure white. And then we can add in our tracking mesh. Okay, and we don't see much happening yet because we have no light in the scene. So let's grab our spotlight and our 3D text. Okay, so now we're starting to get shadows, but we want the shadows, but we don't want the 3D text. So let's get rid of the 3D text in this scene. So I'm going to add another override 3D. And we're going to put that override in between the 3D text and our 3D scene. And in this override, we want to turn on do unseen by camera, unseen by cameras. And it'll still cast the shadow, but it won't be in the renderer. So now we have the shadow for our 3D text. But as you go through, there's two things. I don't see the shadows on the poles. And also, as we come back down here, let's go to the beginning, you can see that the cards are actually casting some shadow, and we don't want that. So let's take a look at this first card. And what we need to do is turn on the lighting again. So we're going to turn on affected by lights, shadow receiver. We also need to go into the material, and we want to turn off the lighting, but turn on shadows. Okay, so that should make the cards catch the shadows. Let me see if that was working properly. There we go. So now you're starting to see shadows on the poles. Let's go down back to the beginning though. And we have this other problem here, which is this shadow being cast on the ground from the card. And we can fix that by going into the transmittance. And we just change that color to white, and there you go. Now it's gone. So now we need to do that same operation to each one of these cards. So go into the cards. We go on it. There we go. Okay, so now let's see what we got here. Okay, so let's merge this in and start seeing what we have. So I'm going to grab our camera renderer. Oh, before we do that, if we look at the camera renderer, we have to redistort back to HD. So I'm going to grab our redistortion node, copy that, paste it up here, and then we need this redistortion map put into it. And then let's grab our renderer. And then, okay, now we're back to regular HD. And then from here, we want to add a merge. And we'll shift, drag it into this pipe. We want our main images coming from here in the background, and this one in the foreground. Let's take a look at the merge. And in that merge, we want to change apply mode to multiply. Okay, so let's take a look at the final comp. Okay, so the shadows are looking pretty good. We definitely need to add a little bit more detail. So let's go into the spotlight. Let's go down to shadows. And let's bump this up to like 4K. Okay, now we're getting some nice shadows. I'm just gonna jump through a little bit, see how they look. Okay, much nicer. Okay, so those are looking pretty good. So at this point, I think a couple more things that I would do to really help sell this shot would be to maybe add a little bit of blur to the 3D text. Not that much. That helps blend it in a little bit because the image isn't so sharp. and maybe even add some grain to the text just to help blend it in, but otherwise it looks pretty darn good. So here's an example of what I got for my final composite. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.